The neighbors caught a black boy stealing food and wanted him punished. But when they saw his empty fridge, in the heart of Millbrook, a once thriving industrial town now struggling with poverty and racial tensions, lived 12-year-old Tyrone Jackson. With skin as dark as the midnight sky and eyes that held both fear and defiance, Tyrone was a child of circumstances beyond his control. His father, once a proud factory worker, had been laid off 2 years ago and had since fallen into a spiral of depression and alcoholism. His mother, Sarah, worked 2 jobs as a cleaner, leaving before dawn and returning long after Tyrone had gone to bed. Their small, dilapidated house on Elm Street stood as a stark reminder of the town's decline. Peeling paint, a sagging roof, and overgrown grass made it an eyesore in a neighborhood desperately clinging to respectability. Tyrone, often left to fend for himself, had become a frequent target of suspicion and scorn from the neighbors. Chief among these neighbors was Mrs. Gladys Peterson, a 68-year-old widow who had lived on Elm Street for over 4 decades. With her tightly permed gray hair and ever-present floral dresses, Mrs. Peterson saw herself as the neighborhood's moral guardian. She watched the comings and goings on her street with hawk-like vigilance, quick to report any perceived infractions to the local authorities. Mrs. Peterson had taken a particular dislike to the Jackson family. In her eyes, they represented everything wrong with the changing demographics of Millbrook. She viewed Tyrone with a mixture of fear and contempt, convinced that the boy was destined for a life of crime. On the other side of Tyrone's house lived the Thompsons, a middle-class black family who had moved to Elm Street 5 years ago. David Thompson, a high school teacher, and his wife Lisa, a nurse, had 2 children of their own. They were aware of the Jacksons' struggles but felt helpless to intervene, caught between their desire to help and the fear of being seen as interfering. As summer descended on Millbrook, bringing with it sweltering heat and rising tensions, none of the residents of Elm Street could have predicted how their lives were about to intersect. A simple act of desperation was about to set in motion a chain of events that would challenge their preconceptions, test their humanity, and potentially change the course of young Tyrone's life forever. The day that would alter the trajectory of Tyrone's life began like any other sweltering July morning in Millbrook. As the sun rose, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Tyrone awoke to an empty house. His mother had left hours ago for her first job of the day, and his father was passed out on the couch, empty bottles scattered around him. Tyrone's stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder that their cupboards were bare. His mother's next payday was still 4 days away, and the few dollars she had left for food had been spent days ago. Tyrone knew he should head to the community center where free lunches were provided during the summer, but the thought of the long walk in the oppressive heat and the pitying looks from volunteers made him hesitate. As he stepped outside, the heat hit him like a physical force. Tyrone's worn sneakers scuffed against the cracked sidewalk as he began his aimless wandering. He passed by the Thompsons' house, where he could see Mrs. Thompson tending to her small garden. She looked up and offered him a smile, but Tyrone quickly averted his gaze, embarrassed by his rumbling stomach and shabby clothes. Further down the street, he saw Mrs. Peterson sitting on her porch, her sharp eyes following his every move. Tyrone could feel her disapproval radiating across the street. He quickened his pace, wanting to escape her judgmental stare. As Tyrone rounded the corner onto Main Street, he found himself in front of Miller's Grocery. The small family-owned store had been a fixture in Millbrook for generations. Through the large front window, Tyrone could see displays of fresh fruits, vegetables, and other tempting foods. His mouth watered at the sight, and the gnawing ache in his stomach intensified. For a long moment, Tyrone stood frozen on the sidewalk, wrestling with a decision that had been brewing in his mind for days. He knew stealing was wrong. His mother had raised him better than that. But the hunger was becoming unbearable, clouding his judgment and pushing him towards desperation. Taking a deep breath, Tyrone pushed open the door to Miller's Grocery. The bell above the door chimed, announcing his entrance. Old Mr. Miller, who was restocking shelves, looked up and nodded a greeting before returning to his task. Tyrone's heart raced as he pretended to browse the aisles, all the while acutely aware of the security cameras mounted in the corners of the store. Finally, when Mr. Miller disappeared into the back room, Tyrone saw his chance. With trembling hands, he grabbed a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter, shoving them hastily into his oversized jacket. He was about to reach for an apple when he heard the bell chime again. To Tyrone's horror, Mrs. Peterson entered the store. Their eyes met, and in that instant, Tyrone knew he had been caught. Mrs. Peterson's eyes narrowed as they flicked from Tyrone's face to the suspicious bulge in his jacket. "Mr. Miller," Mrs. Peterson called out, her voice sharp and accusing. "I think you need to check this boy's pockets." Panic surged through Tyrone. Without thinking, he bolted for the door, knocking over a display of canned goods in his haste. The crash echoed through the store as Tyrone burst out onto the street, his feet pounding against the pavement as he ran. But Tyrone's freedom was short-lived. As he rounded the corner back onto Elm Street, he collided with a solid figure. Strong hands gripped his shoulders, stopping him in his tracks. Tyrone looked up to see Mr. Thompson, concern and disappointment etched on his face. "Tyrone, what's going on?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Before Tyrone could answer, Mrs. Peterson came huffing around the corner, her face red with exertion and righteous anger. "Thief!" she shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Tyrone. "I caught him red-handed at Miller's." "Call the police, Mr. Thompson. It's high time this delinquent was taught a lesson." As a small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion, Tyrone felt the weight of their stares. Shame, fear, and hunger warred within him as he realized that this moment would change everything. The stolen food fell from his jacket, landing at his feet like damning evidence of his desperation. As the tension on Elm Street reached a fever pitch, with Mrs. Peterson loudly demanding Tyrone's arrest and Mr. Thompson trying to calm the situation, an unexpected voice cut through the chaos. "Wait!" The command came from Lisa Thompson, who had emerged from her house upon hearing the commotion. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of concern and determination, scanned the scene before settling on Tyrone's trembling form. Lisa approached Tyrone slowly, as one might a frightened animal. "Tyrone," she said gently, "can you tell us why you took the food?" For a moment, Tyrone remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ground. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. I was hungry. We don't have any food at home." This simple admission sent a ripple through the gathered crowd. Mrs. Peterson's righteous anger faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Lisa knelt down beside Tyrone, her nurse's instincts kicking in. Now that she was closer, she could see the signs she had missed before. The hollowness in Tyrone's cheeks, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his clothes hung loosely on his frame. "When was the last time you ate, Tyrone?" Lisa asked, her voice laced with growing concern. Tyrone's response was a barely audible mumble. "Day before yesterday." A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had been so quick to condemn, fell silent. Lisa gently placed a hand on Tyrone's shoulder. "What about your parents? Where are they?" At this, Tyrone's composure finally broke. Tears began to stream down his face as the words tumbled out. He told them about his father's struggle with alcohol, about his mother working endless hours just to keep a roof over their heads. He spoke of empty cupboards, of trying to stretch meager meals, of the shame that kept him from seeking help. As Tyrone's story unfolded, a profound shift occurred among the gathered neighbors. The anger and judgment that had been so palpable just moments ago gave way to shock and then to something deeper, a dawning realization of their own complicity in Tyrone's suffering. Mr. Thompson, his face etched with guilt, spoke up. We had no idea it was this bad. Why didn't you say something, Tyrone?" Tyrone's response was a mixture of defiance and despair. "Would you have listened? Does anyone ever really see us?" His words hung heavy in the air, forcing each person present to confront their own assumptions and prejudices. Mrs. Peterson, who had been so certain of Tyrone's inherent criminality, now looked stricken, her earlier certainty crumbling in the face of the boy's obvious distress. As the full extent of Tyrone's situation became clear, the mood on Elm Street underwent a seismic shift. The revelation of his desperate circumstances forced the community to see beyond their preconceptions and recognize the human suffering that had been unfolding right under their noses. In that moment of shared understanding, The neighbors of Elm Street were faced with a choice. They could continue down the path of judgment and punishment, or they could choose compassion and seek a way to help a child and a family in crisis. The direction they chose would not only determine Tyrone's fate, but would also reveal the true character of their community. As the initial shock began to wear off, all eyes turned to Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, silently looking to them for guidance on what to do next. In the tense silence that followed Tyrone's revelation, Lisa Thompson made a decision that would set the course for everything that followed. With a determined set to her jaw, she stood up and addressed the gathered crowd. "Enough of this," she declared, her voice firm but compassionate. "This boy doesn't need punishment, he needs help. We've all failed him by not seeing what was happening right in front of us. It's time we did something about it." Lisa turned to Tyrone, who was still trembling slightly, tears drying on his cheeks. "Tyrone, honey, you're coming with us. We're going to get you some food, and then we'll figure out how to help your family." Mrs. Peterson, still reeling from the shock of Tyrone's circumstances, found her voice. But he stole. We can't just let that go unpunished. What kind of message does that send?" David Thompson stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on his wife's shoulder. "The message it sends, Mrs. Peterson, is that our community takes care of its own. Tyrone made a mistake, yes, but it was born out of desperation, not malice. Punishing him won't solve the real problem here." As murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, Tyrone faced a critical decision of his own. The Thompsons' offer of help was everything he had secretly longed for, but accepting it meant admitting defeat, acknowledging that he and his family couldn't manage on their own. It meant facing his parents' reaction to his theft and the exposure of their struggles. For a long moment, Tyrone stood frozen, torn between his pride and his desperate need for help. Then, slowly, he nodded, accepting Lisa's outstretched hand. The consequences of this decision were immediate and far-reaching. As Lisa led Tyrone into their home, the neighbors began to disperse, many of them wearing expressions of shame and introspection. Mrs. Peterson, looking suddenly older and deflated, retreated to her porch, her worldview shaken to its core. Inside the Thompson home, Tyrone sat at their kitchen table, a plate of sandwiches and a glass of milk in front of him. As he ate, Lisa and David gently coaxed more details about his home situation out of him. The more they learned, the more concerned they became. "We need to contact social services," David said quietly to his wife. "This goes beyond just needing some groceries. Tyrone and his family need real, long-term support." Tyrone, overhearing this, felt a surge of panic. "Please," he begged, "don't call them. They'll take me away from my mom. It's not her fault." Lisa knelt beside him, her eyes level with his. "Tyrone, we're not trying to separate your family. We want to help all of you. But to do that, we need to involve people who can provide the right kind of assistance. Do you understand?" Reluctantly, Tyrone nodded. He knew, deep down, that things couldn't continue as they had been. Something had to change. As David made the necessary calls, Lisa helped Tyrone clean up and provided him with some of their son's old clothes that fit him better than his worn-out garments. The simple act of putting on clean, properly fitting clothes seemed to straighten Tyrone's spine, restoring a small measure of dignity. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. A social worker arrived, asking Tyrone gentle but probing questions. Representatives from local food banks and community support organizations were contacted. And through it all, the Thompsons remained a steadfast presence, advocating for Tyrone and his family. As evening fell, a police car pulled up outside the Thompson home. Tyrone's heart sank, certain that Mrs. Peterson had followed through on her threat to involve law enforcement. But to his surprise, the officer who entered was not there to arrest him. "I'm Officer Martinez," the woman introduced herself. "I'm here to do a welfare check and to escort Tyrone home. We'll need to talk to his parents about what happened today." The walk back to Tyrone's house was tense. Officer Martinez and the Thompsons flanked Tyrone protectively, while curious neighbors peeked out from behind curtains. As they approached the rundown house, Sarah Jackson emerged, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. "Tyrone, where have you been? I've been so worried," she cried, rushing to embrace her son. What followed was a difficult conversation. Sarah broke down in tears as the events of the day were recounted and the extent of their struggles laid bare. Tyrone's father, roused from his alcoholic stupor by the commotion, listened in silent shame. As Officer Martinez explained the support services that would be made available to them, and the Thompsons offered their continued help, Tyrone felt a complex mix of emotions. There was relief at no longer having to carry the burden alone, shame at having resorted to theft, and a glimmer of hope for the future. That night, as Tyrone lay in bed, his stomach full for the first time in days, he reflected on the day's events. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and hard work for his entire family. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. The knowledge that there were people willing to help, that his community had seen him, truly seen him, gave him a strength he hadn't known he possessed. As he drifted off to sleep, Tyrone made a silent vow. He would make the most of this second chance, not just for himself, but for his family and for the community that had chosen compassion over condemnation. As the days passed following the incident with Tyrone, a subtle but significant change began to take root on Elm Street. The revelation of the Jackson family's struggles had forced the community to confront the poverty and hardship that existed in their midst. Hidden behind closed doors and polite facades, Mrs. Peterson, in particular, found herself grappling with the consequences of her actions and beliefs. The image of Tyrone's tear-stained face and the memory of his desperate confession haunted her. She had always prided herself on being a pillar of the community, a guardian of morality and order. But now she was forced to question whether her rigid worldview had blinded her to the real issues facing her neighbors. One afternoon, as Mrs. Peterson sat on her porch, she noticed Sarah Jackson trudging home from work, looking exhausted and defeated. In a moment of impulse that surprised even herself, Mrs. Peterson called out to her, "Mrs. Jackson, would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" Sarah hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the invitation from a woman who had never shown her anything but disdain. But something in Mrs. Peterson's expression, a mixture of guilt and genuine concern, made her accept. As the two women sat in Mrs. Peterson's meticulously kept living room, an awkward silence hung between them. Finally, Mrs. Peterson spoke, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Jackson. I've been unkind, and I've made judgments without understanding your situation. I'm truly sorry." Sarah's eyes welled with tears at this unexpected admission. As she accepted the apology, the conversation gradually became easier. Mrs. Hessat Peterson listened, really listened, as Sarah shared the challenges her family had been facing. By the end of their talk, Mrs. Peterson found herself offering to watch Tyrone after school, giving Sarah peace of mind and allowing her to pick up extra shifts at work. This interaction set off a chain reaction throughout the neighborhood. Other residents, inspired by Mrs. Peterson's change of heart, began to reach out to the Jacksons and to each other. The Thompsons' garage sale to raise funds for the Jacksons turned into a community event, with neighbors donating items and time. Meanwhile, Tyrone's father, John, was fighting his own battle. The shame of his son's actions and the realization of how his addiction had affected his family spurred him to seek help. With the support of a local recovery program and the encouragement of David Thompson, who had become something of a mentor, John began the difficult journey towards sobriety. As these individual stories of change and growth unfolded, they wove together to create a larger narrative of community transformation. Elm Street, once divided by suspicion and indifference, was slowly becoming a place of connection and mutual support. This secondary plot of community renewal provided a backdrop against which Tyrone's own journey of redemption would play out, adding depth and complexity to the main narrative and highlighting the ripple effects of compassion and understanding. In the weeks following the incident, the relationship between Tyrone and the Thompsons deepened in ways none of them had anticipated. What had begun as an act of crisis intervention evolved into a genuine mentorship and friendship. Lisa Thompson, drawing on her experience as a nurse and a mother, took Tyrone under her wing. She helped him catch up on the medical care he had been missing, ensuring he got proper nutrition and even tutoring him to improve his struggling grades. Tyrone, initially wary of accepting help, found himself opening up to Lisa's gentle but firm guidance. "You know, Tyrone," Lisa said one afternoon as they worked on his math homework, "you're a bright kid. You could do anything you set your mind to." Tyrone looked up, a mix of hope and doubt in his eyes. "You really think so? Even after what I did?" Lisa's gaze was steady and warm. "Especially after what you did. It takes courage to face your mistakes and try to make things right. That's a strength, Tyrone, not a weakness." These words had a profound impact on Tyrone. For the first time, he began to see his actions not as the mark of an inherent flaw, but as a misstep he could learn and grow from. David Thompson's relationship with Tyrone took a different but equally important form. Recognizing Tyrone's need for a positive male role model, David began including him in activities with his own sons. Whether it was playing basketball in the driveway or working on small repair projects around the house, David provided Tyrone with the male attention and guidance he had been sorely lacking. One Saturday, as they were repainting the Thompsons' fence, David broached a sensitive subject. "Tyrone, I've been meaning to ask, how are things with your dad? I know he's been trying to get sober." Tyrone was quiet for a moment, his brushstrokes slowing. It's hard," he finally admitted. "Some days are good, but others, I don't know if he'll make it." David put a comforting hand on Tyrone's shoulder. "Recovery is a tough road, but your dad is trying. That counts for a lot, and no matter what happens, you've got people in your corner. Remember that." This conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Tyrone began to see David not just as a neighbor or a teacher, but as someone he could trust with his fears and insecurities. Perhaps the most surprising relationship development was between Tyrone and Mrs. Peterson. The elderly woman, determined to make amends for her past behavior, had begun inviting Tyrone over for cookies and conversation after school. At first, these visits were awkward and tense, but as the weeks passed, a tentative friendship began to form. Mrs. Peterson shared stories from her youth, painting a picture of a neighborhood and a world very different from the one Tyrone knew. In turn, Tyrone opened up about his dreams and fears, finding an unexpectedly sympathetic ear in his former adversary. "You know," Mrs. Peterson said one day, her eyes twinkling with mischief, "I wasn't always this old biddy you see now. I had my share of scrapes when I was your age." Tyrone's eyes widened in disbelief. "You, Mrs. Peterson?" "No way," she chuckled, a sound Tyrone had never heard before. "Oh yes, let me tell you about the time I borrowed my father's car for a joyride. I thought he'd skin me alive when he found out." As Mrs. Peterson recounted her youthful misadventure, Tyrone felt a weight lift from his shoulders. If even Mrs. Peterson had made mistakes and moved past them, maybe there was hope for him too. These evolving relationships provided Tyrone with a support system he had never known before. Each interaction, whether it was Lisa's encouragement, David's guidance, or Mrs. Peterson's unexpected friendship, helped to rebuild Tyrone's self-esteem and sense of belonging in the community. As summer turned to fall, the changes in Tyrone were visible to all. He walked with more confidence, smiled more readily, and engaged with his neighbors without the fear and suspicion that had once characterized his interactions. The relationships he had formed were not just changing him. They were transforming the entire fabric of the Elm Street community. The climax of Tyrone's journey came on a crisp autumn evening, 3 months after the shoplifting incident. The Elm Street Community Center was hosting a neighborhood meeting to discuss recent positive changes in the area and to plan for future improvements. Tyrone, along with his parents, the Thompsons, and Mrs. Peterson, were all in attendance. As the meeting progressed, various residents stood up to share their experiences and ideas. The atmosphere was one of hope and collaboration, a far cry from the tension that had characterized previous gatherings. Then, to everyone's surprise, Tyrone raised his hand to speak. With encouragement from Lisa Thompson, Tyrone made his way to the front of the room. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the faces of his neighbors, some familiar, some still strangers. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "3 months ago, I did something I'm not proud of," Tyrone started, his voice shaky but gaining strength as he continued. "I stole food because I was hungry and scared. I thought I had no other choice. But that day showed me that I was wrong. It showed me that even when we think we're alone, There are people willing to help if we're brave enough to let them." The room was silent, all eyes fixed on the young boy who had once been seen as a troublemaker, now standing before them with courage and maturity beyond his years. "I want to thank everyone who helped my family," Tyrone continued. "The Thompsons, Mrs. Peterson, and all of you who donated or offered support. You didn't just give us food or money. You gave us hope. You showed us that we're part of this community." Tyrone paused, visibly gathering his courage for what he was about to say next. "But I also want to apologize to Mr. Miller for stealing from his store, to Mrs. Peterson for running away that day, and to all of you for not trusting that you would help if you knew we were struggling. I'm sorry, and I promise to do better." As Tyrone finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Mrs. Peterson was openly weeping, and Mr. Miller, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, made his way forward. "Tyrone," Mr. Miller said, his voice gruff with emotion, "your apology is accepted. But it's us who should be apologizing to you. We failed you as a community, and it took your actions to wake us up to that fact. So thank you for your bravery, both then and now." The meeting that had started as a simple community gathering had transformed into a powerful moment of collective reconciliation and commitment to change. As neighbors stood up one by one to echo Mr. Miller's sentiments and offer their own apologies and pledges of support, it became clear that this was a turning point not just for Tyrone, but for the entire Elm Street community. As the meeting concluded, there was a palpable sense that something profound had shifted. The residents of Elm Street left the community center that evening, not just as neighbors, but as a united community, committed to supporting each other and addressing the underlying issues that had led to Tyrone's desperate act. For Tyrone, standing with his parents and surrounded by neighbors who now looked at him with respect and understanding, this climactic moment marked the end of one chapter in his life and the beginning of another. One filled with hope, support, and the promise of a brighter future. In the wake of the emotional community meeting, the residents of Elm Street were galvanized into action. The raw honesty of Tyrone's speech and the collective realization of their past failings had sparked a determination to create lasting change in their neighborhood. A committee was formed to address the issues that had come to light, with David Thompson elected as the chairperson. Their first order of business was to establish a neighborhood food bank, ensuring that no family would have to face the kind of desperate hunger that had driven Tyrone to theft. Mr. Miller, moved by Tyrone's apology and his own part in the boy's story, offered the use of a storage room behind his grocery store to house the food bank. He also implemented a pay-it-forward system in his store, allowing customers to purchase extra items that could be claimed by those in need. Mrs. Peterson, eager to continue her journey of redemption, volunteered to coordinate the food bank's operations. Her organizational skills and newfound empathy made her an ideal candidate for the role. She worked tirelessly, coordinating donations and ensuring fair distribution to families in need. The committee also focused on creating more opportunities for community engagement and support. They organized skill-sharing workshops, where residents could teach each other valuable skills like basic home repairs, budgeting, and cooking nutritious meals on a tight budget. Tyrone's father, John, even volunteered to share his experiences with addiction and recovery, hoping to help others who might be struggling silently as he had been. Lisa Thompson spearheaded an initiative to provide after-school tutoring and mentorship for neighborhood children. Tyrone, having benefited so much from the Thompsons' guidance, became one of the program's most enthusiastic participants, both as a student and, increasingly, as a peer mentor to younger kids. However, as with any attempt at significant change, the path was not without its challenges. Some residents, particularly those from more affluent parts of the neighborhood, were hesitant to fully embrace the new initiatives. They worried about the impact on property values and the potential for increased crime if their community became known as a haven for the needy. These concerns came to a head at a tense town hall meeting, where voices were raised and old prejudices threatened to resurface. It was Tyrone who once again played a pivotal role in bridging the divide. Standing before the fractious gathering, Tyrone spoke with a wisdom beyond his years. "I know some of you are scared," he said, his voice steady. "You're worried about what these changes might mean for you and your families. But I want you to know something. When I was hungry and desperate, I was scared too. I was scared of you, my neighbors. I thought you wouldn't understand, that you'd judge me without knowing my story. And because of that fear, I made a bad choice that could have ruined my life." Tyrone paused, looking around the room to make sure his words were sinking in. But then something amazing happened. When you all found out the truth, you didn't judge me. You helped me. You helped my family. And in doing that, you made our whole neighborhood stronger. These programs we're trying to create, they're not just about helping people in need. They're about making sure that nobody in our community ever feels so alone and desperate that they think crime is their only option. His words seemed to hang in the air, their impact visible on the faces of even the most skeptical attendees. Slowly, the tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by thoughtful silence and then by constructive dialogue. In the days and weeks that followed, the community continued to work through their differences. It wasn't always easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but guided by the principles of empathy and mutual support that had been born out of Tyrone's experience, they persistently worked towards resolution. One particularly effective initiative was the Walk in My Shoes program, where residents from different backgrounds were paired up to spend a day experiencing each other's lives. This eye-opening exercise did much to break down barriers and foster understanding between different segments of the community. As autumn deepened into winter, the changes on Elm Street were becoming more evident. The food bank was up and running, providing a safety net for families struggling to make ends meet. The after-school program was flourishing, with improved grades and decreased truancy rates among participating students. Even the physical appearance of the neighborhood was changing, as residents came together for cleanup days and home repair projects. Tyrone, watching all of this unfold, felt a sense of pride and responsibility. He knew that his actions had been the catalyst for these changes, and he was determined to continue being a positive force in his community. With the support of his family, the Thompsons, and neighbors like Mrs. Peterson, he was not only staying out of trouble, but actively contributing to the betterment of Elm Street. While challenges remained and the work of transforming their community was far from over, the residents of Elm Street had made significant strides in resolving the conflicts that had once divided them. Through their collective efforts, they were building a stronger, more compassionate neighborhood, one where hopefully no child would ever feel compelled to resort to theft out of desperation again. As winter gave way to spring, the Elm Street community found itself at a crucial turning point. The initiatives born out of Tyrone's incident had taken root and were beginning to bear fruit. But there was a growing realization that their efforts needed to expand beyond their immediate neighborhood to create lasting change. This realization crystallized during a community garden planting day, as residents of all ages worked side by side, preparing the soil and planting seeds. Conversations naturally turned to the future. Tyrone, now a respected voice in community meetings despite his young age, voiced an idea that would set them on a new path. "What if," he suggested, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow, "we invited other neighborhoods to see what we've done here? Maybe we could help them start their own programs." The idea caught fire among the gathered neighbors. They had experienced firsthand the transformative power of community action and empathy. Why not share that with others? A town hall meeting was called to discuss this new direction. The energy in the room was palpable, as residents shared their visions for how they could extend their impact. Ideas ranged from hosting inter-community events to creating a mentorship program for other neighborhoods looking to implement similar initiatives. Mrs. Peterson, her eyes bright with purpose, proposed creating a guidebook documenting their journey and the lessons they'd learned. "We could call it the Elm Street Model," she suggested, to murmurs of approval. David Thompson built on this, suggesting they reach out to local government and nonprofit organizations to create a broader support network. "What we've done here is amazing," he said, "but imagine the impact if we could scale this up to the city level." As the meeting progressed, a clear consensus emerged. The Elm Street community was ready to take their experience and use it as a blueprint for wider social change. They would become advocates, mentors, and partners to other communities facing similar challenges. For Tyrone, this new direction felt like the culmination of a journey he had unknowingly started that day in Mr. Miller's store. From a hungry, desperate boy driven to theft, he had become part of a movement for positive change that now had the potential to impact lives far beyond Elm Street. As the meeting concluded, there was a sense of excitement and purpose that energized the entire community. They had not only overcome their own challenges, but were now poised to help others do the same. This new direction would require commitment, hard work, and cooperation on a scale they hadn't yet attempted. But the residents of Elm Street felt ready for the challenge. In the days that followed, committees were formed to tackle different aspects of their outreach initiative. Tyrone, with the support of the Thompsons, took on the role of youth ambassador, preparing to share his story and the lessons he'd learned with other young people in neighboring communities. As Elm Street embarked on this new chapter, there was a collective feeling that they were no longer just solving a local problem, but contributing to a much larger conversation about community, compassion, and social justice. As the Elm Street community prepared to share their model with other neighborhoods, Tyrone found himself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past year. Sitting on the front steps of his home, which now sported a fresh coat of paint thanks to a community renovation project, he marveled at how much had changed, not just in his surroundings but within himself. The angry, desperate boy who had once felt invisible and unvalued was gone. In his place was a young man with a strong sense of purpose and belonging. Tyrone had not only improved his grades significantly, but had also discovered a talent for public speaking and community organizing that surprised everyone, including himself. "You've come a long way, son," came a voice from behind him. Tyrone turned to see his father, John, joining him on the steps. John's eyes were clear, his hands steady. 9 months sober and counting, nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "We both have, Dad." The relationship between father and son had been one of the most profound transformations. As John committed to his recovery, attending AA meetings and counseling sessions, he and Tyrone had slowly rebuilt the trust and connection that addiction had eroded. "I'm proud of you, Tyrone," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm sorry it took something like this for me to wake up and be the father you deserve." Tyrone leaned into his father's side, accepting the embrace that would have felt awkward just a few months ago. "I'm proud of you too, Dad," he murmured. Across the street, Mrs. Peterson watched the scene unfold from her porch, a smile playing on her lips. She too had undergone a remarkable transformation. The bitter, suspicious woman who had been so quick to judge was now one of the community's most ardent supporters of inclusivity and compassion. Mrs. Peterson reflected on how her relationship with Tyrone had changed her perspective on race, poverty, and community responsibility. She had learned to look beyond appearances and assumptions, to see the humanity in everyone. This change hadn't always been easy. She had had to confront her own biases and prejudices, but the reward had been a richer, more connected life than she had ever imagined possible at her age. For the Thompsons, the past year had reinforced their belief in the power of community and the importance of taking action. Lisa and David had always considered themselves good neighbors, but their experience with Tyrone had pushed them to a new level of engagement and advocacy. "You know," Lisa said to David one evening as they watched their children play with Tyrone in the front yard, "when we moved here, I never imagined we'd be part of something like this." David nodded, squeezing his wife's hand. "It's amazing what can happen when people come together." Tyrone's story could have ended so differently. The growth wasn't limited to individuals. The entire Elm Street community had evolved. Neighbors who had once barely acknowledged each other now greeted one another by name. The community center, once a neglected building used only for occasional meetings, was now a hub of activity, offering everything from job training workshops to art classes for children. As Elm Street prepared to share their story with other communities, there was a collective sense of how far they had come. They had transformed a potential tragedy into an opportunity for growth, learning, and positive change. And in doing so, they had not only changed their neighborhood but had also redefined what it meant to be a community. The journey hadn't always been easy, and there were sure to be challenges ahead. But as Tyrone and his neighbors looked to the future, they did so with hope, determination, and the unshakable knowledge that together they could overcome anything. 1 year to the day after Tyrone's desperate act of theft, the Elm Street community gathered for a celebration. The once neglected park at the end of the street had been transformed into a vibrant community space, complete with a playground, community garden, and a small amphitheater. As Tyrone stood on the amphitheater stage, preparing to address the crowd, he felt a sense of awe at the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Looking out at the faces of his neighbors, Mrs. Peterson, the Thompsons, Mr. Miller, and so many others, he saw not just a community, but a family. "A year ago," Tyrone began, his voice strong and clear, "I thought I was alone. I thought no one cared. I was wrong." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "What I've learned, what we've all learned, is that no one is alone when we choose to see each other, to understand each other, and to help each other." As Tyrone continued his speech, the central themes of their journey resonated through his words: the power of compassion, the strength found in community, and the transformative nature of second chances. He spoke of the challenges they had overcome and the work that still lay ahead as they prepared to share their experiences with other communities. The applause that followed Tyrone's speech was more than just approval. It was a reaffirmation of the bonds that had been forged through adversity and mutual support. As the celebration continued into the evening, with neighbors sharing food, laughter, and stories, there was a palpable sense that Elm Street had not just overcome a crisis. They had created a model for positive change that had the power to impact lives far beyond their own community. In Tyrone's journey from a desperate act to a catalyst for community transformation, Elm Street had discovered a profound truth: that compassion, understanding, and collective action could turn even the darkest moments into opportunities for growth and positive change.